Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Let's get rolling. I wanted to talk today about a number of different, somewhat related religious movements focused primarily on healing. And they all began with the work of a man from New England named Phineas Quimby, who called himself a magnetic healer or a mesmerist. These days, mesmerism is generally used to refer to hypnosis, but the way Quimby used it was not exactly hypnosis, although there may have been a hypnotic component to it, meaning it was based on suggestion. I think that is accurate. But really, again, it is a kind of alleged alleged magnetic healing where people would go to Quimby, and Quimby would claim that there is a kind of universal magnetism, what later people in that movement would call a universal mind, and that if you connected yourself with that universal mind, you too could be healed. And so healing did not depend, to Quimby, upon seeing a physician. It depended upon having the right state of mind and upon praying. Praying was the major factor in healing. It was a kind of what later people also called a mind cure. You are cured not only by your own individual mind, but by the universal mind and your ability to connect with that mind and to experience healing through it. One of Quimby's patients was Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science and the author of the textbook Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. That used to be a very widespread religion. It was so widespread, many Jews were becoming Christian scientists. And so there was a movement started called Jewish science, which was basically Christian science in Jewish language, which attempted to prevent Jews from leaving Judaism and staying in Judaism, but being able to follow the basic principles that were practiced by Christian science. And I have read much of the Jewish science literature, and it reads like the work of Quimby and Eddy. It is not significantly different. So it literally was an attempt to forestall the leaving of Judaism by so many Jews back at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So at one time, not now, Christian Science was very powerful, was very influential. It is a classical example of American religion, classical example that you could be healed by your own efforts. You did not need a physician. Rugged individualism. If there was ever an example of rugged individualism, it is the work of Quimby, Eddy, and these other movements that I will talk about over the next several minutes. So, in Science and Health, with Key to the Scriptures, Eddy argued that one should only see a physician for a few minor cases. The major one is having your bones set if your bones were broken. But aside from that, and maybe one or two other things, one should only consult a Christian Science practitioner. Who were these Christian Science practitioners? They were, excuse the pun, professional prayers. Professional prayers. That's literally what they were. And yet they were trained and certified as Christian Science practitioners or professional prayers. And so you would call up this office and speak with somebody over the phone, and they would pray with you. And that was the way or the route to being healed in Christian Science. Mary Baker Eddy herself was regarded as being a prophetess. Here's the problem with that. Mary Baker Eddy was a patient, I guess, or a client of Phineas Quimby. If you read the writings of Quimby, as I have, and you read Eddy's book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, there are parts of it that are literally word for word the same. In other words, Eddy plagiarized Quimby's writings. Now, to this day, Christian scientists claim, really claim very vociferously that no, Mary Baker Eddy was a prophetess. She certainly did not plagiarize from the words of Quimby. And yet all you need to do is to read Quimby and read Eddy side by side, and you can see that the similarities are too stunning to ignore. So obviously, yes, Eddy did plagiarize Quimby. But she claimed that they were all her own original ideas. So she was also a liar. Not unusual in religions for people to be liars, but Eddy was a very profound liar in that one respect. When I was much younger, say in my teens and early 20s, when you walk down any major street in the US, you would see Christian Science reading rooms. These were places you could go into. They had Christian Science literature, including Science and Health. You could sit there and read that material. I have not seen a Christian Science reading room in decades. I do not know if they even exist anymore. Maybe in Boston, which is where the organization is headquartered, maybe there are reading rooms there, but nowhere I have ever been recently. And I used to see them all the time. But now they're, to my observation, nowhere to be found. Christian Science has been on a downward slide for a long time. We will get to the reasons for that in just a bit. Because of the fact that Christian Science was so adamant that a person could not see a physician, there were some people who basically agreed with many of the principles of Christian Science, but who were more open-minded and who felt, well, God can heal you through prayer. God can also heal you through medicine. So there was nothing wrong with pursuing either or both of those paths. That movement became known as New Thought. There are numerous denominations of New Thought. The three major categories of those denominations are religious science, divine science, and unity. Before I moved down here to the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, I lived in the Kansas City area on the Kansas side, but only a 20-minute drive from Unity Village, which is the international headquarters for Unity. And I went there only once. I don't know why I did not go back. It's a beautiful place. They have a tower on the property. That is a tower where people go and they sit and they pray. It is a pure imitation of Christian Science. So people could call and speak with Unity prayer practitioners and receive prayer for their ills. One could also call a person in religious science or divine science, and they would do the same. But again, in New Thought, there was more open-mindedness to going to a conventional physician than there was in Unity. There was not the same hostility toward conventional medical treatment that you found in Christian Science. There are many Unity churches around the country. In fact, there is one pretty close to where I live. I'm not aware of any divine science or religious science churches near me, but Unity, yes. And because of its open-mindedness, I think that is why it has continued to exist, meaning there is no dictate from on high that no, you can never see a physician. I would imagine that would be a turnoff for many people. It certainly would be a turnoff for me. I probably would, even if I was a member, go to see a physician anyway, which would contradict my reasons for being a member of it. But New Thought imposed no such limitation. Now, there were variations between these New Thought denominations. Unity is very Christian. It uses a lot of Christian language. Religious science does not. Religious science is professedly secular. It does not claim to be Christian at all. And divine science is somewhere in the middle. Over time, Christian Science, divine science, other New Thought ideas began to spread to other religious movements, like the power of positive thinking. Norman Vincent Peale is a direct outgrowth of Christian Science and New Thought, a direct outgrowth. He got the ideas directly from Christian Science and from New Thought. More recently, in Pentecostalism, you have the Word of Faith movement, which is generally connected with the work of, let me make sure I pronounce his name correctly, Kenneth Hagin. Kenneth Hagin is generally seen as the founder of Word of Faith. It is a combination, I guess you could say, of New Thought and Pentecostalism. They claim that if you believe that you are healed, you will be healed. It is sometimes called say it and claim it Christianity. If you say it, if you confess it, if you believe in your heart that you will genuinely be healed, you will. All of these movements, they have a lot of similarities between them, but I will tell you an anecdote. This one is related specifically to a denomination of religious science. I was attending a class in the Religious Science Center of Kansas City on the Missouri side. In that class, it was being taught by the minister of that congregation. And I figured I would ask the minister a question. I guess it was a trick question, but it was a reasonable question, I thought, nonetheless, based upon all the things he had said about the fact that we are all healed by the universal mind, which is their name for God, and that we don't need anything else except God, and that if we go to a physician, that is also the universal mind healing us. And his argument was that if you believe that you can do something, if you believe that you are well, you will be well. So here was my question. You can see why it was a trick question in a way. I said, Minister, say I was on the moon and I believed that I could breathe without an oxygen tank. I could take my oxygen tank off and throw it on the ground of the moon. Would I be able to do that? Immediately, he looked very, very nervous. That was not the kind of question he wanted to get from anybody. But I guess he felt he had to answer it because I said that, well, I'm really curious if you believe that. Do you think that that is possible? He took a deep sigh. I remember it like it was just yesterday, but it was, I imagine, about 30 years ago. And he said, well, if you really believed it, I guess you could. I felt like laughing hysterically. I did not. I felt like this is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard in my life. And maybe it was. If not, it comes pretty close. But that is in accordance with the beliefs of their religion, that healing is a matter of the universal mind. So if you believe that you can be healed by a physician, by prayer, then you will be healed. No ifs, ands, or buts. The healing will be automatic and instantaneous. That is New Thought, but that is Christian Science as well. That is the power of positive thinking. That is the word of faith. They are all connected to each other. It begins with Phineas Quimby, goes down to Mary Baker Eddy, goes down to New Thought, goes down to Norman Vincent Peale, and goes down to Word of Faith. The same exact movement. Do most people in those movements know that they are related? I don't know. I would assume that most people in Word of Faith would say no. Our teachings come directly from the Bible. They are not from New Thought, they are not from Quimby, and they are not from Eddy. But that's just my assumption. If they would say that, they would be factually wrong, because they all do come from Quimby. And Quimby, unfortunately, well, or maybe fortunately for him, I don't know, has never gotten the credit he deserves. He was the true founder of Christian Science. In fact, Quimby himself used the term Christian Science. Mary Baker Eddy even got that term from Phineas Quimby. Not even his ideas, just his ideas, but even the name for her denomination. She got that from Quimby as well, and yet she always denied that she derived Christian Science from the work of her own healer, the healer that she went to on multiple occasions, Phineas Quimby. Now, do people in New Thought acknowledge their connection with Christian Science? In my experience, generally, yes. Do people in who believe in Norman Vincent Peale's ideas accept their connection with New Thought and Christian Science? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. So it is variable. But I can tell you, as a sociologist of religion, that they are all intimately connected. They are all what I would call, as a social theorist, ontological idealism. Ontological refers to being, how things exist. Idealism refers to the mind. And so the basic idea is that what exists, the only thing that exists, is the universal mind. And our own minds are portions of that universal mind. Now, here's how I will relate this to Maoism, Third Worldism, because I think it is very appropriate, even necessary in a way, that these movements are American-based movements. All of them, from A to Z, or if you're in Canada, from A to Z, started in the United States. Every single one of them started in the US. And that should not be a surprise at all. Why? Money, property, power, getting more stuff. You pray for stuff. You pray for healing. The whole concept behind all of these movements is that whatever you want, you can get by applying your own mind by connecting your mind to the universal mind. It is based on the idea that whatever you want, whatever you like, is achievable for you. You can get it. You can get it. It is not a pie in the sky thing. Healing or anything from a perspective of ontological idealism, whether Quimby, whether Eddy, whether New Thought, whether Peel, or whether Hegel. It is all based on the same principle that what you want, you can get. What does that sound like? I will give you only one guess. Capitalism. Capitalism. Is it any surprise that the most capitalist country in the world, the US, is the father or the mother of all of these movements? In my opinion, it should not be a surprise at all, because they are all capitalistic. They are all based on the idea that whatever you want, whatever you think, whatever you imagine, whatever you dream up in your mind, however ridiculous, like being able to breathe on the moon without an oxygen tank, you can do that because the mind is in control. The mind has power. Everything in the world is mental or supermental. And that is the one thing that I could say that they all share, this universal belief in the all-powerful mind, the mind that pervades the universe, the mind that to them is God himself or herself. That is how they conceive of God. God is a mind. God is an intellect. And we, with our own minds, are small portions of that one single universal mind. So what has happened to these movements? What has happened to Quimby? What has happened to Eddy? What has happened to New Thought? What has happened to Peel? What has happened to Hegel, and so on? They are no longer that popular. Do they exist? Yes. Especially the Pentecostal forms, especially Word of Faith. Word of Faith is still alive to a degree, but not as big as it once was. And I have a hypothesis of why I think that is. It does not work. It does not work. I mean, if you belong to a religion that repeatedly fails to do what it claims to do, are you going to stay in it? Well, maybe for a while. There is a theory in social psychology called cognitive dissonance theory. The classic book on it is a book which deals with a UFO cult. The followers of this American, as might be expected, UFO cult kept on predicting that this UFO was going to land on the earth, take all of the followers of the cult into the sky and back to their own planet, and afterwards the earth would explode and no one would be left on the earth. There were 3 sets of predictions. All of them, well, all of them failed. This is back in the 1950s. They all failed. For the first time, the head of the cult was able to rationalize it and say, well, I made a slight misstep in my calculation. People were willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. Second time, she again said, well, again, I made a slight miscalculation, but this time I have it right. Third time, it did not work. her followers would not go along with her anymore. And so that UFO cult was no more. Nobody could make any explanations. Nobody could come up with a justifiable explanation for how, after three successive failures, that this cult would succeed in going off into the universe in a UFO, while the rest of humanity would burn up like dust on the earth. And so that cult is no more. That is cognitive dissonance theory of Leon Festinger, who was the guy who came up with it. So Festinger's theory is a brilliant theory because it works. It works over and over again. And in the sociology of religion, we use it all the time. It is dependable. So if you belong to a religion which claims that you can be healed by your mind, and more importantly, by the universal mind, but it doesn't happen, and you see people dying left and right, how long will that religion be around? Not that long, maybe for some time, but eventually people are going to realize, gee, I got myself mixed up in something that is absurd. I should not belong to this religion anymore. And so that is what has happened to Christian Science, to New Thought, to Peel, to Word of Faith. They are simply a shadow of their former selves. And so from a Maoist third worldist perspective, we see how this capitalistic system, the promises that the capitalistic system has made for so many decades, that the poorest among us could become wealthy. Didn't matter how poor you were. If you work hard, if you strive, if you struggle for wealth, you will get money. The harder you work, the more successful you will become. A blatant lie. That is not the way things work. That is not the way the economy works either. That is not the way the market works. The market does not work based upon wishful thinking or even based on hard work. The best predictor of success is not hard work. The best predictor of success is your parents. If your parents were wealthy, the chances are that you will be wealthy too. If your parents were poor, the chances are that you will also be poor. That is the way things really operate in the world. And so when people eventually realize that, I assume, these movements began to go on the decline. And so now, even though they're not dead, I mean, Peel's ideas are alive, Eddy's ideas are alive, New Thought is alive, Word of Faith is alive. But I remember back in the 70s, even into the early 80s, when these movements were large. They were large. You would see people going into these Pentecostal Word of Faith churches, being called up by the minister. The minister would touch the person, or maybe hit the person on that person's forehead. The person would fall over, caught by ushers. Then the person would claim that she or he was healed and would throw away her or his crutches. I remember one church I attended from time to time that was a Word of Faith church. It was the Massapequa Word of Faith Tabernacle, or Massapequa Gospel Tabernacle, something like that. The minister was Gene Profeta. He was a very notorious, maybe you could say scandalous individual. If you have ever heard of Jessica Hahn, who was the woman who had sexual relations with James Baker from the PTL Club. Yeah, brought down Jim Baker, at least for a time. That was Jessica Hahn. Jessica Hahn was Jean Profeta's secretary. I met Jessica Hahn before she was known. Nobody knew who she was. Nobody ever heard of her. I do not know whether that incident with Jim Baker had happened yet or not. Not sure about that. I've tried to place the time, but I'm not sure enough to say it definitively. But it may have already happened. Regardless, I feel bad for her. She was abused. She was a victim of sexual abuse, in my view. She was, in effect, a church secretary turned into a prostitute. She later became a centerfold in Playboy. That's how much her life had deteriorated, had turned from being successful, if you can call being a secretary successful, but at least respectable, to being totally unrespectable. And as a communist, unlike many progressives, I do not support prostitution. I do not support pornography. I see it as abusive. The abuse of women, and sadly, in some cases, the abuse of children as well. So I have no love or affection. I do not respect the rights, the supposed rights of sex workers. I believe that they have a right to be helped because they are tools. They are instruments used by men for their own pleasure. And I cannot support something like that at all. And the fact that I know so many progressives who do tells me why I could never, under any circumstances, be a progressive, being opposed to sex work, not to sex workers. They are victims too, but to what they do, to the men and sometimes women who put them into those positions. So Jessica Hahn was a victim of that, but the church that she worked for was a Word of Faith church, and I would go there regularly. When you would walk into the main auditorium where Jean Profeta preached, there were canes, there were crutches, there were wheelchairs hanging from the wall. There have been studies done on that movement. What those studies have found is that typically when people are supposedly healed in a Word of Faith church, within days, they go back to the condition that they were in before. But the embarrassment of admitting that prevents them from going back to the church and saying, Pastor, I am no longer healed. And so many people are left with the incorrect impression that those people were actually healed, when actually it was simply a mental mind game. I guess you could say in that case, it was a kind of self-hypnosis or auto-suggestion. For the time being, this has been Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.